Welcome to the Speak Like a Leader podcast with John Bates. Welcome to the show. With me today is Shama Hyder, a longtime friend, and she is the founder and CEO of Zen Media, which is a full-service agency specializing in B2B marketing, PR, and all the rest of the stuff that a full-service agency does. And Shama is known for having an eye for what's next and how brands can stay relevant in such turbulent and fast-moving times. She's a keynote speaker. She talks about AI, generational change, and all of the other factors that play into staying relevant in today's world. Welcome, Shama.
Thanks for that great intro, John. Pleasure to be here. It's nice to see you after a minute.
Yeah, it's nice to see you. It's been a long minute, hasn't it? I think we originally met through Mike Michalowicz, isn't that right?
That's right. Yeah. Mike is another fellow speaker / buddy of ours.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm glad that we finally got you on the show. So, it's called Speak Like a Leader.show. So I would love to start out with just hearing from you, maybe, let's start with somebody who had a big impact on you and a story that you remember as you've been coming up, as a leader and running Zen Media and being a CEO and founder. Who's somebody whose story had an impact on you? Or what's a story?
Gosh, I would say that the person that comes to mind right when you say that is my graduate advisor, Dr. Donna Ballard, who was at the University of Texas at Austin. And, it's not so much her story, but just her in action, which was so inspiring for me. And for a couple of reasons. One, being a woman and being a woman of color in a very professional, a collegiate university environment. And for me, being able to see that, right, her in action with people who were, she's probably the closest person I ever found who I felt like looked like me. And, I'd never seen a woman of color before in the professional world, not up close, not like that, right?
Yeah.
So I'm in college. She's my graduate advisor / mentor and now a dear friend. So, but it was really neat. And the reason I say that, it's not so much even her story, but it was her presence and her way of being. And, it was my first experience in managing what I will say multiple stakeholders, right? Because Donna had to, as anybody who's ever worked in a university, and I think especially professors don't get enough credit for this, you have to manage multiple stakeholders like nobody's business. You have students, obviously, whose needs aren't always the same as whatever your head of the department wants or what the university dean wants. And then there's university, policies and politics and colleagues. And also because I think when you're at a university like University of Texas at Austin, you have research, but then you are also teaching. So you're expected to be sort of forefront in your industry. And at the same time, you are expected to guide these young minds and do all of this. So anyway, so that's just the first person that comes to mind in terms of both as a mentor and as someone who I have a lot of respect for.
Yeah, good. So does anything stand out about how she acted or a situation she managed or something like that?
Yeah. So, specifically, it's interesting that you asked that because I remember being in her graduate class and she was my grad advisor. So I got my bachelor's. I have a master's in organizational communication and technology. And so that means she oversaw pretty much all my work. And I remember because when you are a grad student, you get a stipend to go to the National Communication Association meeting annually, right? Like whatever that is. And so you get a stipend, you go to this thing where there's a lot of scholars and they talk about communication and organizational communication and what's happening in the field. And it's great, except for me, what I was studying was new media, right? So I was really fascinated by this little site that you might be familiar with called Twitter back in the day.
Yeah, right.
And it had 2,000 users. So super early days for this platform. And I'm fascinated, right? I'm instantly hooked. I think this is going to change the world. This is going to change comms. This is going to be everything. So I look at conferences and there's not any really conferences. But there's one teeny tiny conference called Blog World and New Media Expo in Las Vegas, right? And so
Uh-huh.
this is, by the way, Blog World eventually became so big, it split into two different conferences. And, this is going back like 16 years almost. And this is the conference that I really want to go to, but I'm a grad student. So of course I'm broke. And so I asked Donna, I'm like, hey, can I use that stipend to go to this conference instead? And it's just not done before. Everyone goes to the traditional conference that everyone goes to. And so, of course, Donna said, well, yeah, let's work together. Let's, make a case for it. And I remember when I was filling out the application, she said, leave out the blogging part, just put New Media Expo. Because, there's not a lot of respect for blogging, I guess, at that point. Arguably, maybe even not today. So anyway, so that's how she got me the stipend. And all my colleagues and fellow students and peers went to Chicago for the conference. I got to go to Las Vegas, and I don't even know if I was 21 yet, to be honest, but it was such an experience. And it was just, that's the story that stands out in my mind when it comes to, balancing stakeholders and
Right.
looking out for what's right. And sometimes being able to do things that are not by the book. I think that's an important hallmark of a good leader.
Right. I agree. And I also, what I really like about that story personally is just her willingness to back you and believe in you. And, look where that led, right? You guys are now good friends. You've got a whole business that's based in that world that you went to in that first little conference. And I really think that's another great hallmark of great leadership, is someone who is willing to look for the greatness in you and see it in you and help you bring it out. And so that's a great, great story. So wow, that was like 16 years ago, and a lot has changed. So tell us about, your approach to keeping people relevant and how, what are some principles that we could maybe take away from you and your experience in that world?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. You know what, John, I got my start in social media, right? Which is very much current culture. And now I tell people, like, social media is just shorthand for the internet. It's everything, right? It's gone through so many evolutions. And I don't just mean platforms, but how we use it, all these things. So yeah, relevance, I think, is fascinating because we work with a lot of legacy brands. And it's really interesting to see the legacy brands that break through and stick around and have that moment, right? And then they're able to parlay that history and that legacy into the new world and be relevant for a world today. And this is true for both legacy brands and newcomers to the scene. But I'm just focusing on legacy brands because I think people would know them. And so you think about like the Barbie, right? Barbie in general, as a doll, as a franchise, and that bridge that it took really last year to becoming more relevant in pop culture, in connecting those dots to women's empowerment, all the stuff, right? And how they made themselves relevant in a new age. You think about even a brand like Claire's, which was, if you grew up in the 90s or 2000s, this is like everybody went to Claire's at the mall. And at one point, it really fell out of that relevance. And now their new leadership and new CMO are bringing that back. And so I find that sort of fascinating, that trajectory of what is it when brands can embrace what's happening right now on so many levels. And so for relevance, I think three things are happening, right? And my role in sort of the day-to-day is using marketing and PR to tell these stories and to connect these dots and to keep brands in the forefront. And so if you think about what's happening, there's really three big things that we are facing sort of collectively. So the first is, this, you talked about it, AI, competing with AI. What does that look like? What role does it play for us? And I do think, we're in such an interesting moment in history where, talk about like we're going from the industrial age to information age to this is really going to be sort of that knowledge AI age. It's one element, right? It's one element. And I think people who are saying, how do we be relevant using just this are missing the big picture because there's other things happening at the same time. And so the other thing you look at is, so there's AI, that's huge. how is this going to shape the future of work? How's this going to shape, how we connect with audiences? Even now, more and more, it's interesting. People are less reliant on like a traditional search engine and then go to AI for answers. So what does that mean when it's able to aggregate all the information? And then how do you get in front of people? So there's sort of that element. Then, of course, you have this generational change, which I really think is so underestimated right now. Meaning this year, John, the most popular birthday in the US is 65. It's the most popular birthday. More people will turn 65 than any other age, which is just mind-blowing and fascinating if you think about it. But you think about all the repercussions, right? And the stuff that we don't really think about in terms of that. One of those things that has happened sort of quietly is that there are now more Gen Zers in the workplace than baby boomers.
Yeah.
It's a huge shift. So millennials still make up the majority of the workforce, but for the longest, baby boomers, that's a big part of the audience. But now as they hit this magic sort of number, and again, you have this new leadership, new folks who come in and they've been raised in a very different environment. And so you have a huge generational shift that's about to occur and is occurring. It's one of those things that happens slowly, and then all of a sudden. And then you have, social media as we know it. And I tell people all the time that it's really split. Social media used to be the sort of one term, and now you have social and you have media. And all that means is that we consume content publicly, but we share privately. And so, right? So like, think about someone's listening to this podcast right now, John. They're not going to leave a comment. They're not going to message you, or they're not going to message me. They're not going to, right? They're not going to raise their hand publicly and be like, this is great. Not to say that not everybody will, but the majority of folks, we consume, you and I, we consume a lot more on a day-to-day basis than we actually engage with in a proactive manner where everyone can see it. So almost like the novelty of the internet where we had like buttons and emojis, like that's gone, right? We don't have that anymore. What we have is all these sort of dark social channels, meaning, WhatsApp groups, Slack channels, direct messages. And so all of this stuff that kind of happens in the shadows or things you don't see. So for example, last year, I had a chance to keynote for APMF in Bali, which is amazing, great experience, super nice people. And when I got there, I learned that an individual on their team had watched my videos and really advocated for me to be the keynote speaker that year. But I didn't know her until I met her, right? Like, this is not someone who'd left comments or sent me emails, or we had not engaged one-to-one. Yet there she was advocating for me to come speak to their group and their event. And so I think there's something really magical there, but it also changes things because consumption is engagement, right? How many people listen? How many people these things matter. So anyway, so I think these three things coming together, that is what's really changing the future of business, changing the future of work. And what that means is we need to think about relevance in terms of all three of those things. And how do we stay relevant to a changing audience? How do we stay relevant in terms of new AI technology, whatever that is? Because frankly, we can't even predict it. We can only learn to adapt to it. And these ideas of how individuals and our buyers, our prospects, consume information and act on that information. And it's not always where we can see it. Yeah.
It's a really, really good point. And, admittedly, it's something that's kind of driving me a little bit crazy. I feel like I personally don't really know how to reach people. And, it's not like you just take out an ad on CBS like you used to do 100 years ago, right? Like not quite 100 years ago, but
almost.
Right. So what are some of the things what are some examples of how people are taking all three of these things into account and what they're doing without giving away all your secrets?
Sure. No, and I'm happy to. And John, so you're not alone, right, in feeling that way. And look, it is, if someone says, gosh, it's so much harder today to reach people and get your message out, I say it is. You're right. Absolutely, it is. Yeah. It's harder than it's ever been. It's interesting, right? It's harder than it's ever been. That's just true, because if you could throw money at it, you could pretty much reach your audiences. But today, even if you throw money at it, you have so many different channels. So I think, yes, it's harder than it's ever been, and it's more accessible than it's ever been. So in that way, it's interesting, right?
Yeah,
because
right.
it's changed the playing field, because before money was your only currency. Now, don't get me wrong. I want to be really clear about this. A bad strategy with lots of capital will still win over a great strategy and no capital. And
Right.
I think this is so important, because people think there's some creativity or panacea, or they look at great campaigns and they don't realize no, there is great capital behind it, great resources driving these things forward. So yes, you still need that. I think the ability to go viral, so to speak, or have virality is fascinating. And just even studying this, right? Like, what makes something go viral versus not go viral. And of course, in my world and PR, we study this, we love this, we want to figure all of this out, trying to figure, how do we make this, what does that look like? And so, yeah, look, it is harder. I think there's a couple of things, when we look at brands, your most basic thing that I think most companies and most individuals, most brands are missing, is that they are playing a very fragmented game, meaning it's a little bit of this here, a little bit of this, that, but there's no cohesion to their strategy. So one of the things we started doing as a company in these last years was creating playbooks, which basically look at all these disparate things and show brands how to pull it together. And that has honestly been our number one offering, funnily enough, where people are they need this. And what I mean by that is, if you think about even the work you do, John, you can do this. You can sit down and put your stuff, in these boxes. So there's 4 boxes or 4 circles, and they all kind of have to work together. You have owned. These are your channels. This is the thing that you're doing right now, right? This podcast, it's content you create, control, distribute. Then you have earned media, which is a lot of what we do. And it's so important, right? Because it's what other people say about you. It's me doing this podcast right now is earned media. This is like us in action right now, right? Because it's not what I say, it's what my good friend John says about me to his audience. Then you have paid, which most people, such a pet peeve of mine, where they say, oh, marketing is advertising. I'm like, no, it's not. Even great, renowned publications, respected publications will jam marketing as advertising. And I'm like, it's one very small, now big area in terms of how much spend it gets, but paid, right? That's one area. And certainly to your point, whether it's radio or TV or billboards or digital, whatever, there's ads. We can talk about that and how that landscape has changed so much too. And then you have rented channels. And rented channels are the things where that is social platforms, that is Discord channels, that is those Reddit groups. Those are anything that you don't necessarily own, and it is social, but it is broader than that, right? So it's rented channels. It might be a newsletter, right, where you get mentioned. And now, don't get me wrong, there's overlap in all these things. So basically, when we find that companies aren't seeing results, even though they're putting in budgets and whatnot, it almost always is because they're doing these things, but they're not playing together. So it's almost like an orchestra where you got a violin over here and you got, a cello over here, but there is no conductor there to turn it into a symphony. And I think that's the part that is so much harder to do today, but the most important thing. So I would say for any brand listening or anyone listening that feels frustrated, I would say do this exercise, put things in these buckets, and then think about how those buckets are playing together or not playing together as it may be.
Yeah. So give me an example of how they could pull together. I mean, would it be putting the same thing out on all the channels at the same time in a coordinated fashion? Would it be what, to give us just a little bit more flavor on that?
Yeah, let me give you a very specific example, right? Let's look at earned media. It's a lane that we play a lot in.
Okay.
Let's say, I'll give you an example. When one of our clients does a podcast, let's just use that as, keep that theme running. So let's just say one of our clients does a podcast. Cool. The Problem is that so many people think earned media provides both credibility and distribution. Like it used to once upon a time, right? Meaning like if you ended up on the New York Times page, gosh, everyone and their grandma was going to read that. Today, that's just not true. While it may give you credibility, it is not going to give you distribution. And so you have to think about how do you use that credibility to create your own distribution? So when like, again, going back to this example of it's earned media, client has a podcast, they have a great, awesome. Then we take a clip of that. We take 60 seconds, little snippet, and can turn that into a video. Now that plays on social. So you can use that on rented channels. You can put it on LinkedIn, put it on Instagram, right? You can, and then beyond that, you're sharing that on own channels. So you have a newsletter list that goes out. Great. Are we talking about what, the key points from that in that newsletter? Are we, the other part that I think, so it's funny because PR and sales are two separate words and like people don't even pull those together.
Yeah.
But I actually think that PR-enabled sales is incredibly important. And it's not just top of funnel, but really can be used throughout the funnel. The problem is most people don't know how to use it. Most salespeople are not trained on how to use it. So they don't understand it. So part of that is, can you teach them how they can use these assets in their sales process? So when they open a conversation, when they're nurturing a conversation. So let's use this as an example, John. Let's say that, you've got your team and you want a keynote on a certain event, right? And your team, I'm making this up. This is, by the way, I have no idea how any of your stuff works in the back end. Right. So it's like hypothetically, right? Yep. Or let's even say someone reached out to you and your team is nurturing that to say, we'd love for John to come speak at some point. Now, rather than checking in with the event planner every year and going, oh gosh, hi, I was checking in to see, is this a good year for John to come speak? Instead, if they take something and say, your supply chain, again, making this up, John just talked about how the supply chain industry is going to change in a dramatic way and what it means to lead in that industry today. And I thought you might be interested in that clip. And you share that. And then they respond and they're like, wow, this is so cool. These are the same things we're talking about. So you see, there's ways in which you use content that is completely missed by most organizations. And it's not even for lack of knowledge. It's just they don't know how this sort of symphony is meant to go together.
Right. Yeah. That puts a lot more clarity to that. So what is something that you're thinking about really? Like, obviously you're thinking about this, but what's something else in this world of, let's talk about AI for a minute. Maybe let's, go deep on one of these multiple things. There are the three things that you mentioned, AI, generational change, and then social media as we know it, and the split there. So let's go in order. So AI, one of the things that I've noticed is that there was this incredible bloom of AI content everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. And then very, very quickly, it became very, very obvious what was AI generated content. And I think people just go, did you notice anything similar? What do you think about AI and how it's shaping things right now?
Yes. So it goes back to that old adage to say marketers ruin everything. And I think that's true. Look, I would rather they'll have a world where people are trying different things, even if some of those things are just bad, right? And what I mean by that is like LinkedIn is a great example where all of a sudden when I was doing a post, I'd get like 10 immediate comments and they all had the same, cadence. Right. It was like, this is invaluable. And so like you could start to figure out very quickly.
Indeed. Yeah.
And so just certain things where you're like, okay. And, so very quickly it becomes obvious, which by the way, if you see that, the best thing you do is just block those, delete and block, right? Like, cause that those are bots and so forth. But a part of me though was still sort of proud and was like, I'd rather people play with this and learn and kind of get good at it. You know what I mean? Because it is for anybody who's not staying up until 2 a.m. playing with these tools right now, you're missing out.
Yeah.
It is a whole new world, and I understand it can be daunting, and I understand, but I think just like anything else, you have to play with it. It begins like a toy, right? It begins with something fun, and then there's an evolution of, oh, how do we use this? And
Right.
we've been using AI for a while, in different layers and levels. And so, for example, we were the first PR firm to release an AI tool called Snooze or News. And it's there, it's snoozeornews.com. And you can go put in a press release and it'll tell you if it's a snooze or if it's newsworthy. Right? Because there's just so many press releases out there and they're awful. And so that's what this tool allowed you to do, was to go in and say, okay, like how, and it's a fun tool. And I think there is an element that so many times companies don't realize, like things can be fun. That's not a bad thing.
Right.
I think often we look at fun as like a bad word in business, but really,
it's a keyword. Like that's one of my most important words.
Yeah. And I think it's so important for consumers, both B2B and B2C, to have that element in your things. And so I think there's a difference. You can still be serious and not take yourself so seriously. And so I think with AI, it opens up a lot of opportunities. The easiest way to think about it is, yes, optimizing your current workflows, being more generative. Think about, again, this podcast, John, your team was sending my team emails. We're trying to coordinate. If AI does all of that and then we just show up, right?
Yeah.
So it takes out so much of that, what I will call sort of logistical or mundane or whatnot. Now, yes, there is, one of the downsides is we see a lot of content that is clearly written by AI. I think AI will get better at it. I really do. Now, that being said, I think what's most important is not more content, but a unique point of view. And I think that becomes rarer and rarer, is what is that unique point of view? What, even as a leader, right? So that's what this podcast is about, is as a leader, what is your point of view? What do you believe? What do you hold sacred? What is important to you? What brings you meaning? And then what does that look like translated at the organizational or cultural level? And I think those are the kind of questions that I find myself asking. Is not just, I don't spend a lot of time thinking, oh my God, this technology, will it absolutely take jobs? Yes, of course it will. Will it create new jobs? Yes. Just like the typewriter did, just like every innovation and every technological advancement has created, especially as we think about, we have an aging population. What will we do? Well, if you have a lot of technology as leverage, it's not such a terrible thing then, right? Because you don't need lots of kids to work the farm. That changed too. We needed lots of kids to work the farm. Well, when that changed and people moved to the cities, then they didn't need that as much. Right? So like right now, as humanity, we worry about, oh my gosh, our birth rate is going down and all these, globally, of course, and countries are getting older. And one of the reasons we want that to change that trajectory, among others, is, well, what about the labor pool? What happens, economically speaking? But what happens when one young person, I put that in quotes if you're hearing this and not seeing it, can do the work of 10 young people?
Right.
Leverage, right?
Yeah.
And so I think these are the sort of concepts that I think about, and I think are so underestimated in the world that we are about to enter.
Yeah. I like all of that. I really like what you're saying about a unique point of view. And, I've been on the commercial internet since 1994 when I started at .com companies. And one of the things that became really clear to me very early on was that it was no longer a problem of enough information, because that was what it was before. It was like, where am I going to get enough of the best information, right? Now, all of a sudden, there was so much information that I think it became an issue of curation of information. And the places that really succeeded were places that curated the information best. And now I think with AI, unique point of view is like that next hill to take. And I really, really like that. I think that's a very good point. So what else, anything else about AI, or should we talk about generational change now?
Yeah, I mean, look, both of those things are very connected, right? AI and generational
Like you
change.
just said.
Right, because you're going to have an entire generation that is more than digital native. I mean,
Yeah.
I, as a millennial, still remember a time not having a phone and not having, like, I came of age as a teenager when, when we had flip phones and so forth. But there's an entire generation where that, my kids, I look at my kids, which are probably Gen Alpha, Gen Z.
Yeah, right.
They're Gen Alpha. And they, my son knows how to swipe and he knows how to, and he's 4 and my daughter's 2 and technology and they know how to ask Alexa to play their favorite Halloween song. Like, they have to ask, they have to say please, because they know Alexa doesn't listen unless you say please. And so
that's good.
Right. And so but it's fascinating to see them and what their expectations are and how they engage. And I look at some of these companies around and I'm like, man, how are you going to keep up with these kids? And when they're your buyers and what their expectations are, when you were still, and look, this is really true in B2B, which is very much still an old fashioned industry that sees marketing as a demand factory, on demand factory for sales, and not understanding that the buyer has evolved so much and that the buyer is not interested in your sales process. They're interested in their own buyer journey.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Say more about, because I just think that, listen, in some ways we've gotten incredibly less sophisticated, but in terms of that, of what you just said, we're interested in our own buyer's journey. Like, talk about that a little bit more, because I feel like the general buyer out there has gotten just tremendously more sophisticated in how they buy.
Yes. And that buyer is us.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, the buyer has got tremendously sophisticated because look, for the longest time, and especially in B2B, and they would have a different standard. It was like, oh man, like, our competitors are selling from an old school brochure. We have a website, like check us out, right? And I think the difference is that people don't buy in a silo. They don't look at B2B and go, oh goodness, let me put on my B2B hat now and be so appreciative that you have a website. They look at it and they go, I'm used to Amazon next day. I get annoyed when my Uber doesn't show up in less than 2 minutes. And I'm like, 7 minutes. Like, what? Right? And so we're so used to, as consumers, our expectations and information and, getting things when we want and how we want it. And these are also very interesting generational things because my son says, Mommy, can't you order it online? Or, and then sometimes he'll say, when will it be here? And I'm like, not for a couple of days. And then they drop the package off in the afternoon. And he goes, it's already here. And so even from a younger age, we are now, so our expectations as consumers do not stay relegated and gated to, okay, this is me as a customer. I have this experience. This is me as a business buyer. I have this experience. Now, the drivers are different. We can talk about that, right? In B2B, a customer, your buyer is trying to avoid regret. Switch that. They're trying to avoid blame. So it's a different emotion. In B2C, they're trying to avoid regret. Okay, I bought this phone. New one came out a year later, right? A few months later. Like, should I have bought, maybe even a year, like, should I have bought that phone or just waited because a new one came out? I take the year back because they do seem to come out every year. Not that it's always worth upgrading every year, right? Yeah. But it's that regret. It's like, do I buy this and then feel bad about it? In B2B, it really is a blame thing, right? So imagine like when John, you and I get pulled on stages to speak, the event planners, when they're hiring us, they're not worried about regretting whether they hired us. Yeah. They might, they're more worried about what if their CEO says, like, what is their board going to say? What is their CEO going to say? What is, what is their boss going to say? Is their boss going to say, wow, I'm so glad this was a great event, great job. You made the right decision. Or are they going to say, hey, what did you do? Who did you rate? So part it's interesting because when I talk to planners and I say, and my team will tell them like, look, there's a lot of variables in an event. Your speaker, your keynote speaker shouldn't be one of them, right? They're vetted, they're good. You know what you're putting on stage. And so it's very similar like that in B2B and B2C.
Yeah.
But in terms of expectations, it's the same. And meaning we want fast, we want easy, we want, quality. And these are things that we as consumers living in this amazing age have really gotten used to.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And, the way I would characterize it is that our expectations as consumers are holistic.
Sure.
Right. Like, because we're experiencing our entire life all the time. So when we get upset because the Uber doesn't get here quick enough, that's going to translate into everything else that we do and what we're looking for and what we want.
Yeah.
So, and I think that there is some generationality to that, right? Because I can remember the busy signal. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, I do.
So, and like, you just don't get the busy signal anymore. In fact, you can barely get through anyway, right? Like, you got to send a text so they'll answer if they don't have you in their phone already.
Right.
Okay. So there's AI and there's generational, and then there's the split in social media. Let's dig a little more deeply into that. I know we only have about 10 more minutes. So I also want to, if there's anything else that you'd like to talk about or anything you'd like to share, I want to make sure we get to that. But let's talk about that split in social media. Will you say a little more about that?
Yes, this is the stuff I love to talk about anyway. So no, this is good and a good culmination point for our discussion here. It's, social and media have split. And very simply, that means we consume publicly, we share privately. And so you think about, the sort of, it's funny because I do this a little bit when I'm on stage and I say I can guess anybody's number one used app, right? Anyone in the audience. It's kind of like a magic trick. And, people are like, oh, any app. I'm like, yeah, anybody in this room, I can guess what your number one most used app is. And inevitably, it is some sort of private messaging app, right? Whether it's iMessenger, it's WhatsApp, it's some place where you are sending direct messages. It's just not a general app or media platform. And it's important because, when I also ask audiences, they say, how many of you watch influencers or look at their content? They're like, of course, right? We're looking at content all day, all sorts of content. We're constantly, how many of you leave comments? Right? All the hands sort of go down. People don't do that. Right. And so it's like, so you consume, but you're not leaving comments. So, even let's say like it's an audience of 1,000 and almost everybody raises their hand of, yes, I follow, I watch videos, whether it's YouTube, on Instagram, TikTok, whatever. And then when you say how many of you leave comments and engage with these influencers, the hands go down. Right? So this is sort of the media aspect where people we're consuming, we're consumers of media. And then when I ask, well, how many of you send often those videos or clips to the same maybe 3 people through direct message? And it's funny because people laugh and then again, almost the entire room raises their hand, right? And so if you think about that, like, right, so we send DMs to the same few people that are inner circle, or it might be whenever it's work related, you share in a Slack channel or you put in a WhatsApp. There's different things. And so, so I just wanted to kind of highlight, like, I think that's a huge shift in how we approach social media, how we create content for it, how we think about it. Because again, even though those are our personal habits, we somehow, when we put on our marketer hat or a business hat, we forget about all these other things. And that's just a shame.
It's a really, really very, very good point. Like, look at your personal habits and then realize that, like, that's pretty much what everybody else is doing too. So why aren't you taking that into account in how you're marketing and reaching out?
Exactly.
Well, so what's one last thing that we should talk about, Shama?
Oh gosh, John, it's your podcast. So we can talk about anything that you'd like.
Well, how about when it comes to like, let's loop it back to community, unless you had something you wanted to say. I was going to say, let's loop it back to communication and leadership and, some of your thoughts around that and how that might play out in this world if you want.
Yes. So I think what's fascinating about communication is it's becoming less of a role and more of a skill set. So LinkedIn just did a survey and they looked at the number one skill that people want from across the board, and it's communication. Right. And so I think one of the things that I'm really passionate about is educating leaders on what communication means. And I mean from all perspective, like media. What is media? So many people who are as CMOs, when I talk to these guys on the daily, they don't know anything about comms as a profession or role, right? When they hear communication, they think like, oh, how we communicate as a skill, but they don't really think about it in terms of what's the role, right? What does that mean as a practice, as a discipline? And how does that connect to other things in my organization? So, everything that we as leaders do. So there's levels, right? There's the macro level, which is this organizational communication. How do we as an organization, how are we communicating? What are our channels? What are we saying and not saying that, what are we not saying that we should be saying? What are we saying that we probably shouldn't be saying? And then at more sort of the micro level, as a leader, how are you communicating with your audience, your group? And so one of the things that I've started to do is in our Slack channel, I put videos in for our team, right? And someone else on our team started this practice, which I think is such a cool idea. So I stole it from him, but I really like this because it's like a quick check-in. It's a, hey, they see your face, they hear your voice. I think this is more important in a hybrid environment now and more remote than ever before. So we think in terms of how you communicate, your digital body language, it just becomes so much more important because when you are siloed, when you were disconnected, and I think there's so many ways of being disconnected, it takes real intention and effort to become reconnected. And I think it's something that you have to prioritize. So there's a lot going on in the comm space, but I do think that, for folks wanting to, I think, I try to do a lot through my LinkedIn and educate people in terms of understand what PR is, understand what comms are, understand what this means for your organization in sort of a modern age.
That's really good. And, that's certainly one of the things that I've been doing a lot over the past several years and that I still see so many people doing poorly is that online communication piece. I think that for many people, your leadership presence is now 90% about your online presence, your video presence, and I think that's a really great idea that you're putting videos into the Slack channel of you talking, saying something, that way they can engage asynchronously, but still see you. They don't have to jump on a Zoom call every time to get a message from you and see you. And it's that, know, like, and trust factor. And I think that's a really, really good idea for any leader who's especially, whose team is essentially virtual. And, I know a lot of places are coming back to the office, but they're not coming back to the office the way they were,
It's different.
It's just very different. So people can find you at zenmedia.com. Is that right?
They sure can. And of course, please connect with me on LinkedIn if you're listening and you have some thoughts. I always welcome that. I think it's become such a great watering hole and some of the places that I've met, really some of my most favorite people.
Yeah, great. I'm super active on LinkedIn too. I think it has become the platform for business. And then there's all those other platforms that you've got to do. And it's really great when you can bring that all together, right? With a plan.
Ideally, yes.
I'm listening. Yeah. So do you know what your LinkedIn address is, just so we can say it? It's probably linkedin.com/in/.
It's Shama Hyder, SHAMA Hyder, HYDER.
HYDER.
Yeah, it's just my name.
DER. Yep. We'll put that in the show notes for anybody, but I just wanted them to be able to hear it. So thank you very much. I know you're very busy. We definitely had some back and forth scheduling this, and I'm just really honored and happy that you made the time to join us. And thanks for sharing all this with us, Shama.
Thanks for having me, John. I hope that anybody listening found a little bit of value in it.
Yeah, I think it's great value. I think, stuff is just really changing, and I sense a certain anxiety out there. And I think it's not just me. I think there's, a certain anxiety among a lot of people around how fast things are changing. And I think you've given us some great tools and some great things to think about in this world, and ways to keep up with that change and stay relevant. So thank you.
My pleasure, John.
All right. And thank you for joining us on speaklikealeader.show. If you'll hit the like button, if you'll share this out with other people, I would very much appreciate it. If you think that this was valuable, share it with somebody else that you think could get something from it. And we will see you next time on speaklikealeader.show. Thank you for joining the Speak Like a Leader podcast. Go be awesome.